After inheriting and expanding his father's banking empire, J.P. Morgan is now among the most powerful men in the nation. His influence over the country is matched by only two other men. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller have been rivals for decades. And that competition has driven both men to incredible heights. At the peak of their power, J.P. Morgan, John Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie are worth the modern equivalent of over $1 trillion combined. More than the entire net worth of the 40 richest people alive today.
The wealth then was like royalty. It was just a different thing. They literally controlled the country. When you're talking about a guy like Rockefeller, it was literally 1% of the economy. It's stunning to think about that. It is almost incomprehensible.
But while Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan continue to get richer, others are struggling to get by. The gap between the rich and the poor is as big as it's ever been. Over 90% of Americans survive on less than $100 per month, while the average worker earns barely $1 a day, well below the poverty line. Working conditions in factories across the country are almost unbearable. In a single year, 1 out of every 11 steel workers will die while on the job. As the country approaches the 1896 presidential election, America's poor are desperate and without hope. One man seized the opportunity to harness their anger, and in the process, propel himself to the White House. William Jennings Bryan. Bryan runs on a ticket promising equality for all, vowing to be a voice for the poor, and to take the fight to the country's elite.
The great combinations of capital have encroached upon the rights of the masses. No man can earn $1 million honestly.
He made himself the spokesman for the common man. He was the great commoner. There's no doubt that he tapped into something that was vital to most Americans that were not well off.
Republicans endeavor to overthrow and discredit all who honestly administer the law, and to allow every wrongdoer to operate unchecked as long as he has enough money.
The monopolies, the trusts became a target of Democrats, so that antitrust became a rallying cry of everybody who was, well, not seen as in the hip pocket of the corporations themselves.
I will tear down these trusts. Do you hear me, Carnegie? Do you hear me, Rockefeller?
Bryan's emergence is the biggest threat the Titans have ever faced. He promises to dismantle their companies and to not rest until they're behind bars.
This is William Jennings Bryan at a recent Democrat rally. He's a prohibitionist and a devout Presbyterian. According to him, Darwin's theory of evolution is a pack of lies. He's an enemy of the gold standard and an enemy of big business. It is certain that he will win the Democratic nomination. What do you think?
The Republican Party has a good candidate.
No. We have to buy our own president.
They took advantage of the strengths. When you have, what relatively speaking is an unlimited amount of money, you can pay people to do almost anything for you.
Desperate to protect the empires they've spent their lifetimes building, the Titans throw their full support behind the candidacy of Ohio Governor William McKinley.
William McKinley's campaign manager was an industrialist himself. And he went essentially hat in hand around Wall Street, dunning them, saying, if McKinley doesn't win, that crazy man Bryan will be president. And if Bryan is president, don't you realize what that is going to do to the credibility of the United States around the world?
The Titans wield more power than any group of men in American history. and they're about to use it.
Much appreciated. This is McKinley's speech that he'll be giving at the Republican convention.
Make sure he sees it in time.
Understood.
Rockefeller, Morgan, and Carnegie each give over $200,000 to McKinley, the equivalent of $20 million today. The campaign is by far the most expensive in American history, and McKinley outspends Bryan by a factor of 5 to 1. But they don't just fund their candidate. The group wields tremendous influence, and they aren't shy about using it. Suggesting headlines and orchestrating PR campaigns aimed at getting McKinley elected.
It was easier to buy the publicity that you wanted in those days than it is now. The news media was a smaller market, and it was easier to feed information to your favorite correspondents then than it probably is now.
Bryan fights back. He undertakes the country's first whistle-stop press tour, crisscrossing the nation and speaking directly to the people. The tour becomes the model for the way presidential campaigns are conducted to this day. Bryan gives over 500 speeches to huge crowds across the country.
I will put rings in the noses of these hogs.
Publicly attacking the nation's richest and most powerful men, and vowing to usher in a whole new era. As Bryan's campaign gains traction, the nation's leading industrialists turn to fear tactics.
Many big employers, many big industrialists said, if Bryan wins the election, business is going to be so bad, we're simply closing shop. So if Bryan wins on election Tuesday, don't bother showing up for work on the next day because there won't be jobs. Well, if you're a worker and this is something that confronts you, you're going to think very seriously, even if you had been intending to vote for Bryan. Which way does maybe your heart leans toward Bryan, but where does your pocketbook point?
On election day, the lines are drawn. It's Wall Street versus Main Street, rich versus poor.
One of the things of an evolving society is the wealth distribution. And it's clear that what we argue about today, that's the core of every politics, is it better with wealth in the hands of a few versus distributing among the many, whether from a moral or an economic point of view.
90% of eligible voters go to the polls, roughly double recent turnouts.
In the 1890s, voting was a public act. And on one side, there was the Republican ballot box, and the other side was the Democratic ballot box. And so your foreman, or an agent of your foreman, could see who you voted for. So there was a certain coercion that was employed by the Republicans upon those urban workers. They might well have decided what they decided on their own, but this simply made it easier for them to decide that.
When the polls close, the nation's future hangs in the balance. For 20 long hours, Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller agonize over the results, not knowing whether the modern country they helped build will still be the same when all the ballots are counted.